Welcome to today's Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're here because, wow, we have a monumental topic to tackle today. We're going to take the massive, incredibly complex history of World War I, and we're going to break it down into a really clear, understandable journey. We're stripping away the confusion, following the timeline, and truly grasping how our modern world was literally forged in the fires of this conflict. Let's get right into it. But before we trace the grand strategies and tactical maneuvers, I need to ground us in this absolutely staggering number, 9.5 million. That's the number of soldiers who died in this conflict, 1 in every 8 who fought. And, when you add civilian casualties to that, the number nearly doubles. This wasn't just some political dispute. It was a total cataclysm that fundamentally transformed the globe at just an immense human cost. Keep that massive number in the back of your mind as we go through today's Explainer. Section 1. The Spark Ignites Europe. Okay, let's dive right into this timeline. What makes that massive death toll we just talked about even more tragic is that, initially, people actually believed the war would be a short, glorious adventure. The sheer speed of how that illusion shattered is just dizzying. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by a 19-year-old nationalist in Sarajevo. Now, normally, this could have just been a localized tragedy, but because of this incredibly rigid web of rival alliances, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, it triggered a rapid-fire domino effect. Within hours, Austro-Hungary is shelling Belgrade. Within days, honoring those complex treaties, Russia and Germany mobilize. And just 6 weeks later, no joke, 6 million men are marching to war across Europe. To really understand the military logic of 1914, you gotta look at Germany's geographical nightmare. They were completely wedged between rival powers, France on one side, Russia on the other. So, enter the Schlieffen Plan. This was Germany's cold, highly calculated strategy to win a two-front war. The idea was to rapidly invade neutral Belgium, sweep down to encircle and crush the French armies near Paris, and boom, grab a quick victory in the west. Only then would they pivot their forces east to face Russia because they assumed Russia's massive army would take way longer to mobilize. It was incredibly aggressive, it relied entirely on speed, and, well, it brought Britain into the war the second Germany violated Belgian neutrality. But, as you might guess, the plan completely failed. Just 40 miles outside Paris, the French and British launched a desperate counterattack at the Battle of the Marne. They hit the brakes hard on the German advance, and that initial momentum completely stalled out. As both sides then desperately tried to outflank each other in this race to the sea, they had to seek shelter from the incredibly deadly machine gun fire and artillery. So, what did they do? They dug into the earth. The illusion of a quick victory was entirely shattered right there, introducing the world to a horrifying new reality. 350 miles of unbroken trenches, literally stretching all the way from the English Channel down to Switzerland. Moving into Section 2, the industrial meat grinder. We are now sharply shifting away from those grand romantic ideas of 19th century combat. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shows the relentless pace of innovation during this conflict, which fundamentally changed the battlefield and absolutely guaranteed horrific casualty rates. We're looking at the terrifying introduction of lethal chlorine gas by the Germans at Ypres. We see the invention of armored tanks by the British, who were desperately trying to break that trench deadlock. There are zeppelins bombing British cities from the sky, U-boats prowling right beneath the waves, and interrupter gears turning standard airplanes into deadly fighter planes. The business of killing had officially industrialized. And this number right here reveals the terrible, terrible result of all that industrialization. 365,000. That's the number of French casualties at the Battle of Verdun alone. The German general Falkenhayn literally designed the battle to act as a mincing machine. His explicitly stated goal wasn't even just to take ground. It was to, quote, bleed France white. It was this grim, brutal strategy of attrition, basically inflicting such enormous losses that the enemy would literally just be forced to surrender. Meanwhile, the Allies launched their own massive offensive at the Battle of the Somme to try and relieve some of that pressure on Verdun. Look at this figure. 57,000. That is the jaw-dropping number of British casualties sustained in just the first few hours of their offensive. They were cut down by German machine gun fire right after an artillery bombardment completely failed to clear the barbed wire. To this day, it remains the absolute worst day in the history of the British Army. And the crazy part? The battle just kept raging on for another 5 months. Which brings us to Section 3, a truly global war. At this point, we really need to zoom out, because this conflict was absolutely not confined to just European mud. And this brilliantly illustrates the vast differences in how the war was actually fought depending on exactly where you were on the map. On the Western Front, you've got this static stalemate where horrific casualties barely bought advances measured in mere yards. But globally, we see highly mobile warfare. We've got British and German forces fighting these intense guerrilla campaigns down in African colonies. We see the British teaming up with Arab rebels, including the famous Lawrence of Arabia, to fight the Ottoman Empire out in the Middle Eastern deserts. Plus massive naval clashes and submarine blockades across the open oceans. It was the whole shebang. But far away from the traditional battlefield, the chaos of the war provided cover for profound atrocities. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire began the systematic deportation and murder of its ethnic Armenian minority, whom they suspected of supporting Turkey's enemies. Tens of thousands of people were transported out into the Syrian desert and simply left to die. The source material notes that in all, more than 1 million Armenians perished. Now, while the Allies condemned the events as a crime against humanity, and historians broadly recognize it as such today, it's important to note that the Turkish government disputes the death toll and officially disputes the classification of these events as a genocide to this very day. Let's move into Section 4, the breaking point. By 1917, this endless strategy of attrition had pushed basically all the major empires to the absolute brink of collapse. Knowing they were running out of time, Germany took a massive gamble. Here's the crucial chain of events. First, Germany resumed unrestricted U-boat warfare, basically hoping to starve Britain into submission by sinking any ship they saw, including neutral American vessels. Second, British intelligence intercepted the infamous Zimmermann telegram, where Germany was actively encouraging Mexico to attack the United States. No way the U.S. was going to ignore that, right? These two provocations finally pushed U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to abandon American neutrality once and for all. The U.S. declared war, bringing vast, desperately needed resources and fresh manpower to the Allied cause. And let me tell you, the Allies needed the Americans desperately, because 1917 was a year of profound crisis. Sheer exhaustion had completely engulfed the Allies. Entire units of the French army actually mutinied, just flat out refusing to launch any more suicidal attacks. The Italian front was absolutely smashed at Caporetto, and, most consequentially, the Bolshevik Revolution took hold in Russia. Lenin took power and immediately signed an armistice with the Central Powers, knocking Russia completely out of the war. This was a total nightmare for the Allies, because it allowed Germany to redeploy 500,000 troops from the east directly over to the Western Front. Germany knew full well that once those American troops arrived in full force, they couldn't possibly outlast them. So General Ludendorff launched one final, all-out gamble in the spring of 1918. Using these brand-new infiltration tactics, they initially managed to break through Allied lines, but ultimately the offensive just ran out of steam and failed to make a decisive breakthrough. Exhausted, hungry, and totally demoralized, the German army had literally nothing left in the tank. This immediately triggered the Allied 100 Days Offensive, which pushed those starving German forces into a full, irreversible retreat. Finally, Section 5, the Ashes of Empires. Let's move to this timeline and see how this builds, focusing on the war's really abrupt end. The collapse of the Central Powers happened in incredibly rapid succession. In September 1918, Bulgaria's army collapses and surrenders. By October, the Ottoman Empire signs an armistice. By November, revolution is actively spreading through Germany. The Kaiser abdicates. And then, on the 11th of November 1918, a German delegation signs an armistice inside a railway carriage at Compiègne. The fighting finally stops. And then, in June 1919, the peace is officially formalized with the Treaty of Versailles. But the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were incredibly harsh. Germany's military was severely restricted in size. Massive, crippling financial war reparations were imposed to pay for the damages. Their overseas colonies were seized by the victorious powers. And, perhaps most significantly of all, Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the conflict in a war guilt clause. As we look back now, it's pretty clear how this specific clause, along with those crushing reparations, became a huge source of deep, lasting resentment within Germany. Now, walk with me through this incredible before and after. Look at this chart here. Centuries-old empires quite literally vanished overnight. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire were completely dismantled. Out of their ashes, newly carved states were born. Nations like Poland, which reemerged after 100 years, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The boundaries of the world were completely redrawn from scratch, transforming millions of lives in the process. So, what does this all mean? it leaves us with a final, absolutely vital question. Looking at all the resentment built right into the Treaty of Versailles and looking at these chaotic new borders drawn across Europe and the Middle East, did these treaties actually bring peace to the world? Or, by punishing the losers so severely and somewhat haphazardly creating all these new nations, did the victors simply plant the seeds of future conflict, basically guaranteeing that the world would soon be at war again? Think on that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.